Welcome to this week's Facebook Live broadcast. We're going to be talking about grief on The Golden Girls, which is one of my all-time favorite TV shows. And the reason that we're talking about grief and The Golden Girls is because this week the podcast that I host called Coming Back celebrated its 10th episode of production. So for every 10th episode, I decided to celebrate that milestone. We will be talking about a fun aspect of grief. And it's not that grief isn't normally fun to talk about, but normally on the podcast what we do is I'll share a story from my life, we'll answer a listener question, and then we'll do an interview with somebody who has come back from grief in a really cool or remarkable way, or has some resources that they'd like to share from their journey. And for every 10th episode, I thought we would deep dive into something really fun that's related to maybe a pop culture aspect of grief, so like a book or a movie or a television series or an album that just dropped that's relevant to grief, so we can see beyond our own stories into the stories that we create that are fiction that still have these grief motifs in them. And as a result, because they do have those fans and do have those followings and do have these characters that we know and love, they're just really fun. So this week on Coming Back, we did grief on The Golden Girls, and you can find a link to that in the broadcast notes. I encourage you to share this podcast or share this broadcast while I'm on it as well, so any other Golden Girls fans that you know can jump on. So I wanted to touch on what's really cool about The Golden Girls as a show is that it's never fallen out of popularity. It's never fallen out of favor. I own this book. It's called Golden Girls Forever, an inside look, or an unauthorized look behind the lanai. And it's a total retrospective of all 7 seasons of The Golden Girls. It's everything behind the scenes. This is my all-time favorite TV show. And in the back of the book, at the very end, they note that The Golden Girls has never fallen out of popularity. For all of the viewers that watched it in all the way from 85 to 92, in the 7 years that it was airing, all the way till it stopped airing live on TV and started going into reruns, all the people from that original audience that have died off have been replaced by younger and newer generations coming in. I've got a comment on there. I see Lindsay says, it's one of my favorite shows. It is mine too. Thank you so much, Lindsay, for commenting. I would love to hear if you know of an episode in The Golden Girls that sticks out at you as specifically being about grief and loss, because that's what we're really talking about today. Very excited to have all of you here. So the thing about The Golden Girls that's so cool is that for every original audience member that saw it from 1985 to 1992 when the show first aired, they're dying off, but they're being replaced by all these new generations of people who are just loving and appreciating not only the comedy that's present in The Golden Girls that it's really famous for. That's what kind of hooks people in, is the comedy of these 4 women living in a house together, but the real life issues and the real life stories and the real life dilemmas that they face, and they hold each other through and then support each other on that journey. And that's what really drew me to the show. I actually was drawn to the show during a moment of grieving in my own life, and you can hear the in-depth story on this week's episode of the podcast. But it was a time when I was experiencing some disconnect and some falling apart, some breakage of a friend group that had been with me for probably about 5 to 7 years of my life. And so it was kind of a really huge shift because I was getting ready to go off to college as well. And I felt very unsupported in this. And so I had another friend who would come over to the house a couple of times over the summer, and we started watching The Golden Girls together, and something about their friendship and something about the fun and the connectedness of their household really spoke to me, and I just latched onto it. And as I got older, and as other things have happened in my life where my mom has died, I've been diagnosed with adrenal fatigue, I have other family members in the hospital, I've made major moves, things like that. The Golden Girls has kind of been this constant undercurrent of a show and of a story that has supported me through my life. And so I want to talk about 3 motifs today that are present on The Golden Girls. The first one is death, the second is divorce, and the third is diagnosis. And if you listen to the podcast, you know that these are 3 motifs that I try and carry through all of my episodes, because death, divorce, and diagnosis are pretty much the top 3 griefs that we experience as humans on this earth. But of course there are more than 40 different types of losses people can experience within their lifetimes. But especially in The Golden Girls, and on something that's a fictional storyline that humans have created that is broadcast for TV, that the things that are going to be there are the most common pictures of grief. So the first motif that comes up in the Golden Girls is death. And it's interesting because the Golden Girls was the first show of its kind to really portray older people as the main characters and not as like crazy Uncle Bob or like Grandpa Jerry or Grandma Sue, and as kind of like standby characters. These four main characters were women in the middle of their lives that were an older age bracket than any other TV show on TV at the time, and so all of their issues were revolving around getting older and around the possibility and the reality that they would one day die. And so there was a lot of anticipatory grief in the show where they all knew one day we're going to die, because we can see each other getting older and we can see each other kind of going through these phases of life. We can see our kids, moving through major milestones. We're watching our parents die, things like that. But then they also just know amongst themselves that time is coming for them. And so there's a lot of anticipatory grief in the show with those milestones of one day we're all going to die. So things like wills come up a lot, things like planning ahead come up a lot in the show. Things like there was one episode where Sophia was trying to bequeath money to Dorothy, and she was upset because she hadn't allowed her to live a life with that money. She was saving it for when she died. There are other episodes where they anticipate, what would our lives be like when we lose our parents? What would our lives be like when we die? And so it's just interesting to have that come up so often as a theme on the show, because in other shows, kind of the main themes and motifs are life milestones, like having babies and getting married and moving into houses, and those things all happen in the Golden Girls as well. But because of the common age and the common bracket that they're all in together, a lot of their focus is on death. And so if you really want to listen to something cool, I really encourage you to listen to the podcast this week, because I pulled some clips from the show, and so about every 2 to 5 minutes or so there's a different clip of the show, kind of explaining and diving deeper into their specific conversations on grief and loss, which I just so love. The second thing I want to talk about, number 2, is divorce in the show. And this is really, really cool and fascinating to me, and this is actually where I got the most listener questions this week, is on the topic of divorce. And it's interesting because in a lot of shows, divorce will come up as an issue, the divorce will happen, and it's used as like a plot intensifier or like a catalyst for something else. And so the couple breaks up, something else happens, everybody's left in the fallout, and then everybody continues their lives. They go back to resuming their regular lives with the new changes they have made. But in the case of the Golden Girls, divorce doesn't just stay in a couple episodes, or doesn't even just stay in the first season. It literally continues as a motif through 7 full seasons of the Golden Girls. And of course the main relationship, the main divorce I'm talking about, is Dorothy's relationship with Stan, who's her ex-husband. We find out in the first episode that he just left her after 38 years of marriage. And she's having to deal massively with the fallout of that. But over 7 episodes, and I pointed this out to some of the listeners that wrote in questions, is that the entire rest of the season and of the series, they're trying to figure out how to interact with each other as people who are divorced but still living lives kind of on parallel paths, because they're still alive. It's not like death where people get snatched away from us and communication breaks off. You have to interact with the person that you have divorced if the relationship is good. Granted, if it's violent or abusive, totally throw that out the window. But in this case, their relationship is relatively amicable, and so Dorothy considers getting back together with Stan. There's an episode where they almost get married. Again, there's an episode where they attend grief counseling together and marital counseling together. There's episodes where they try and navigate milestones in their children's lives, getting married or separating from their own partners together. There's an episode where Stan makes the absolutely awful decision to sleep with Dorothy's sister, and they have to reconcile with that and a therapist at the same time. There's episodes where all she does is slam the door in his face and insult him, and it's a whole struggle to figure out after divorce where we fit into our former partners' lives. And I just love how the Golden Girls displayed that in such a true way, because Dorothy never really stopped being angry or disappointed with Stan, that's how her life went, but at the same time she continued to maintain him as a connection in her life and tried on like all the different options for how he could be present. They like owned real estate together, they did business deals together. She even tried to hook Stan up with Blanche at one point to go on a date during an episode, and that was a whole other kind of fiasco. So I just love how divorce is portrayed here, because it's very true to life. When people get divorced, unless it's in an instance of violent or abusive behavior, these people are still alive. Our former partners are still alive. They're still floating out in the world. And so we have to figure out how they mesh into our space and into our hearts and into our relationships now, because we're not living in the same house, we're not sharing assets with them, but still we're sharing a lifetime on this earth with them. The last thing I want to touch on that the Golden Girls does a really great job of touching on is diagnosis. And part of this, again, like death, is related to the fact that the entire cast is older. And so it's kind of common knowledge that as we get older, we will start falling apart and like start losing ability in different places in our lives. But also there's just things that happen that crop into our lives out of nowhere that we have to face and deal with. And the biggest thing that I talked about on the podcast was the episode called 72 Hours, where Rose finds out that blood that she received during a gallbladder surgery may have contained HIV/AIDS antibodies, and so she may have the disease. And granted, this episode was put out in 1990, when AIDS in the 1980s, it was still stigmatized. People were still afraid of having AIDS, of getting AIDS, and these letters that were being sent out were a real thing that were happening. This was not a concept that the show made up just to have an interesting plot line. There were letters from medical centers, excuse me, there were letters from medical centers going out telling people that a surgery you had, we just found out, has blood that may have contained X, Y, or Z, please come in to get tested. And then these real life people would have to wait for the results. And so they illustrated this motif again in the Golden Girls, and I loved it. And their first thought, I think, as writers, it said in this Golden Girls book, was to have Blanche be the obvious choice for someone who might contract AIDS because of the amount of sex that she has in the show and how sexually open and promiscuous she is throughout the show. But they kind of did a twist here, and they made Rose this character because they really wanted to drive home the point that AIDS and contracting diseases is not something that happens to us because of what we do in our lives. It's not a consequence as a result of what happens in our lives. And it's really interesting. There's this whole fallout scene where Blanche and Rose are arguing about the fact that Rose is intensely stressed that she's waiting for news on this. And Blanche looks at her and she's like, AIDS is not a bad person's disease. Me having it is no different than you having it. It's not a punishment for the way that we live our lives. And that was a total groundbreaking thing to say in this episode. And while everything in her story did turn out okay, it really spoke to a lot of people who were dealing with AIDS at the time, and who were receiving these papers, like these notices of, hey, this might be something that you're dealing with. Lindsay says, when Dorothy is diagnosed with chronic fatigue syndrome, I felt so related to her. I fought for years until I received my diagnosis of, I'm not sure how to pronounce this, Beckett's disease, including doctors making me feel crazy. Yes, absolutely. And I love that you touched on this, Lindsay. Thank you. I actually was diagnosed with adrenal fatigue myself, which is kind of close. I think it's related somehow to chronic fatigue syndrome. And so we are kind of sisters in this little burnout diseases forum together. I absolutely loved this episode because a couple of doctors I went to were like, you're just tired, you don't have anything, or you have something something else entirely, and we're not really listening to symptoms I was giving them, and they were more scaring me and running more tests than anything. And so seeing Dorothy enact this in 2 episodes of this quest to find answers for this disease, this disorder that she knew that she had, but no one could find a name for. It was very fascinating to go on that journey with her. And it was actually the real life story of one of the producers on the show who struggled with chronic fatigue syndrome while she was writing The Golden Girls, and was actually not present a lot with the show because of it, and then came back and wrote about her experience because like AIDS, that was something else in the 1980s that was just being happened upon as a possibility in the medical field. And so that diagnosis as a reality in Dorothy's life was really incredible and still groundbreaking for TV, and also spoke to, this one more than the AIDS episode, spoke to the level of care that we receive from our doctors and our nurses in the medical system. So I absolutely love that you pointed that one out. The last one that I'll touch on really fast in terms of diagnosis is menopause, and this is really funny and also fascinating, again, because of the age bracket of the characters. Like this this age bracket at the Golden Girls gave them so many more things to talk about, because these are seasoned women. They're not learning life for the first time. They're still learning, but this is not their first rodeo. So things like marriage, kids, relationships, what have you, they're not as new as they are in some other episodes where you get the excitement and the thrill and the awkwardness of learning these things for the first time. These Golden Girls are dealing with those issues, but from a more mature age. And so menopause is something that comes up a lot in the show, and the episode I'm thinking of right now is one that I pulled a quote from for the podcast, where Blanche finds out that she, contrary to her belief, she's not pregnant, she's actually going through menopause. And it totally ruins her life, because when we're diagnosed with things, when she was diagnosed with this, it related directly to her picture of her sexuality as a woman. And just the scientific aspect of it, of not being able to have kids anymore, was not what bothered her. What bothered her was the fact that what made her a woman, all of this estrogen and all of these physical attributes, was going to start to fade away, that news. And so reconciling your identity with the diagnosis that has just been given you is a theme that runs throughout the show that I absolutely love. So yeah, that's just a snippet of Grief on the Golden Girls. I really hope that everybody watching, listening here, I saw Dee, I saw Lindsay, I saw a couple of other people pop in today. My biggest hope is that you'll listen to the entire episode called Grief on the Golden Girls, and then if you'd like to, you can comment here, you can join the private Facebook group, which also has a link to it in this live broadcast. You can email me, you can text or leave a voicemail to my main line, which is 312-725-3043, and continue the conversation on Grief on the Golden Girls. Or if it's not the Golden Girls, I would love to hear about another TV show that has impacted your life and your grief in some way, where you can kind of pick up on themes of grief in your world. I have so enjoyed this live broadcast with you. This is just the highlight of my week, and I'm so glad to have seen you all. Please join me next week. I'll be looking for you, and stay tuned. We're going to be doing some more fun episodes in the future, every 10th episode, so I'd love to hear your ideas and your thoughts. Thanks so much for being here today, guys. Thank you for being a friend. I love it. I'll talk to you later. Bye.